Good morning, everyone. Good morning. These are 8th grade students, and we have the pleasure of having Mr. Manfred Lindenbaum here with us. He's a Holocaust survivor. You will have a chance to ask questions at some point. There's a microphone up here that you can come and ask questions for. And I will let him tell his story. It is an honor that he is here with us to share his memories. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah, I do expect everybody to ask questions. First, let me tell you why I talk about my life, my experience. You know, everybody has a story, but and the question I want somebody to ask me when I'm finished is an example of where bad things didn't happen because people didn't stand by and didn't say anything. I could give you 100 different stories that you probably heard about where, well, I'll give you this one. 100 kids come out of the school, they're getting ready to get on the school bus. 2 kids drag one kid off to the side. They beat him up, he ends up in the hospital. This did happen. I could give you 100 other stories like that. 100 kids. A whole bunch of them walked over and watched. The others who were disgusted with the whole thing walked away. And the question is, nobody said anything. Nobody did anything. And would that kid have ended up in the hospital if there were no bystanders? And what is the responsibility of the people that watched or turned away in disgust and didn't say anything? You're not expected to physically put yourself in danger, but when you turn around and walk away, are you responsible for what happened? So it's 1903, and my family is living in Galicia, and there's a lot of racism and bad things happening, and they're looking for a safe haven, and they found one. They moved to Hanover in Germany, and there they were welcomed. There was no racism, there was no problems. My family was Jewish, probably had more Christian friends than Jewish friends. And that was my grandfather moving to Hanover. My father then moved into the Ruhr Valley in Germany, and another lovely town. And very well accepted. We had a tiny little clothing store. We lived in a small apartment above it. And I was, I remember back when I was 5, and my sister always had bunches of her girlfriends over at the house. She was like 12, 13, and they were not Jewish. Then we came around 1930, and in America we had a depression. People were out of work. Things were looking really bad. There were people wandering around. There wasn't welfare. And in Germany it was even worse. And the trains stopped running. People were getting desperate. And so a group of people started saying, there's going to be an election. If you vote for us, we're going to put the German people where they belong. Because according to them, everybody knows that the Germans are superior to everybody else, and everybody else is a Niedermensch, meaning a lower form of person. So you would think somebody would question that, because they also said that if you elect us, we'll get rid of people who are not part of this super race. If they have mental or physical disabilities, they really are not Germans. And if they're communists, and it went down a long list, and we'll get rid of the Jews. So people bought it, and they elected these people. the leader of these people was Hitler. And he didn't do anything by himself. But there were a whole bunch of people who didn't like what was happening, and they kept quiet. And they could say that they kept quiet because they were scared for their lives. It's absolutely not true. In the beginning, where people spoke out, there's another question you can ask me later. Where did people speak out and it made a real difference? Things got bad. We had to put a J in the store, and people were told not to buy in a store which has the J in, meaning Jew, and things got bad all around. So we started to slide into poverty. So the question is, why didn't my parents just get in their car and drive us someplace else? And it's a good and obvious question. But around that time, as the world started to see what was going to happen, that horrible things were going to happen, they had a conference in Evian in Switzerland. And at the conference, led by the United States and Britain, Britain at that point had a huge empire all across the world. And one by one, they said, we're not letting them come to us. And I think Shanghai said we could take some in. Haiti said, but you're talking about millions of people whose lives were in danger. And the world, in effect, said, we're going to keep them where they are. The British Navy actually sank boats of refugees trying to find a refuge. Then they plucked them out of the water and put them in internment camps. So it was not a choice of leaving. There was no place to go. Among other things, at this point, my family didn't have any money. We were poor. And then in the middle of 1938, and this I have a memory of, but by the way, my mother went to the teacher, we all have teachers, right, and said, why is my son getting beaten up in the classroom? And the teacher said, there's nothing I can do about it. Absolute lie. At that point, the teacher, if one teacher and another teacher would have said something, bad things would not have happened. But it didn't. This German officer came into the store, he clicked his heels, he said, Heil Hitler, and said, you can take a small suitcase and 10 marks, which is like $10, and report to the railway station. And at this point, one by one, our Christian friends had turned their back on us, and we had one family that we were still very close to. My father took us over to them, and the decision was that there was nothing to do. There was no place to go, and we didn't have any money anyway, and it would be just bad if we didn't. And we ended up going there. It was a Thursday, and at that point, they rounded up 25,000 people across Germany whose grandparents had come from the east, from Poland, or in our case, Galicia, which is, I guess, now the Ukraine. And we ended up at the police station. They took us to the train station. I remember my cousin went back to a house with her mother, a single mom, and they were stopped at the door, but they let my cousin go in. So she was supposed to go out with something of value, and she came out with her doll, which she still has, and she came out with nothing else. They kept us at the railway station until Friday night, and they waited till the sun came down. Now, one of the people in my family was my blind grandfather, and he was a very Orthodox Jew. In his whole life, he'd never traveled on the Sabbath. So they were these supermen had nothing better on their mind than to keep us there till sundown, so that the ones who were observant and didn't travel on the Sabbath should travel on the Sabbath. I mean, such tiny little minds, such tiny little men who thought they were supermen, and the only way, just like a bully, the only way a bully can feel good is if he's looking down on somebody. And if he's not looking down on somebody, he feels bad about himself. So that's the only way I can describe why they behaved that way. So the train went through the night to the Polish border at a place called Sponge, and they stopped before the railway station, and they emptied thousands of us out of the trains into the field, and then we were like a mile away from the border, and there were Polish guards to keep us out. It was the border with Poland, and I remember the guns and the dogs chasing thousands of people, some of them disabled, up to the border where they weren't able to keep us out, and across the border, and we were in Poland. When I read about refugees today, and I'm sad to say that there's actually millions of them crossing a border looking for safety, I remember the next scene. The next scene was Polish peasants coming with their horses and carts. This was basically before people had cars, except the rich. And the horses and carts, they came to help us, and they loaded their carts up with suitcases and stole them and took off, leaving a lot of the people there with absolutely nothing. And when you read today about refugees being driven across the border, this is very often the kind of reception they get as they're fleeing for their lives. We walked the 5 miles or so to the town of Spongen, and some of the people slept in the horse stables. Some of the people slept in the streets. Some who had somehow managed to smuggle some money in were able to rent places. We were on the 5th floor of a mill. Someplace I have a picture of it. There was no electricity. There was no water. There were no toilets. There was nothing. We were up on the 5th floor, and that's where we stayed for the next 10 months. So, some of the people who either had been able to take money or able to have outside contacts were able to get to Shanghai and a few to other places, but most of us were stuck there. One of the positive things that HIAS, which is an organization which seems to follow me in my life, that's the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, came within a day or two. The first thing they provided everybody was with cloth bags so we could put straw in, so we would have a place to sleep. And after that, there was enough bread for everybody, and the people organized themselves really well. And for me, this was not a really horrible time, because there was my mother, my father, in the beginning my blind grandfather, although later he managed to get into a home for the blind in Warsaw. My sister was there for a little bit. I had a friend or two there, and that was not the worst time in my life. A little kid I can only imagine what the agony that my parents must have been going through at that point. So it was in 1939, in July, August, and the German army is on the border with Poland, ready to come in only a few miles away, and people had already heard about the horrors which they were committing, and there was panic. The refugee organizations got us all down to the train station. There were literally thousands of us. At the railway station, somebody said that we might still be able to get some people to England on the Kindertransport. Have you heard of the Kindertransport? Let me just give you a brief review. In the U.S. House of Representatives, 2 congressmen introduced a bill to let 30,000 Jewish kids into the United States to save their lives. And they couldn't get it out of committee, no matter how hard they tried. I'm not even going to say what some of the comments were on that. There's always bad people and racism and everything anywhere. It's really up to the rest of us when we hear about it, how we react. We know that evil is there, but it can't do anything unless we keep quiet. So in England, which was sinking boats with people trying to escape, the Quakers and the Jews and a bunch of other groups got the government to agree to take in 10,000 children. They arrived from Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Germany, and were taken in by families on the condition that they leave the day that the war's over and that somebody subsidized them. So the 10,000 were there already. It was really over. But when this man announced that he might be able to get some there, my parents quickly pushed me and my brother over to him, and my friend's mother pushed him over, and my friend got hysterical. He was 8 years old and started to cry, and the mother did what any mother would do. She went and she kissed and hugged him and took him with her, and they were both murdered about 18 months later in Auschwitz, which I found out much later. I remember when I saw him leaving, looking at my parents and saying, and I was not crying, how come she's taken her kid and you're leaving me here? And that kind of had an impact on me until I realized what a heroic act it was in the midst of chaos to push your kid over to a stranger because you can't protect them anymore. And from there they went east to Grodno towards the Russian border, and me and my brother, without my friend, headed towards Danzig, which is a port. And on the way, we stopped at a camp where my sister was learning a trade and studying English. And I remember that really well. It was a building deep in the woods. It was ORT, a Jewish organization which did training for around the world. And I was there for 10 days. And if you remind me at the end, I have a picture of when I returned there last June. There I also saw my grandfather for the last time, and we went off on to Danzig, which is a port, and we got onto a Polish troop ship, which they were taking 100 of us, and my sister was with us at that point, and her number was beyond the 100, and she wasn't able to get on, but I ran away, and she dragged me and pushed me on the boat, and that's a scene I can remember, and she was left behind, and me and my brother were on our way to England. Later, I found out that out last year on a return trip, which I'll tell you about later. I found out that there was 100 destined to go on the boat. My sister was beyond that number, and so was I. But my friend who went with his mother was a lower number, and that's probably the reason I got on that boat. I really couldn't tell when I met the brother and sister who did survive. I couldn't tell, wasn't able to tell them the details of that story. By the way, it's time for a question. I need one. Yeah.
Did you ever witness a battle between the Central or Allied powers?
Was there any battle going on?
Was there I don't know. Were you ever experienced one?
Well, the war hadn't officially started, and I think you could say it started when the German army came across the border as I got on the boat. That happened pretty simultaneously. In England, you read about refugees finding a safe haven somewhere, and a kid by himself, like right now we have, 50,000 kids on our border with Mexico, and I can feel their pain, because the people in England who took in kids saved their lives and were heroes, and my brother got into a beautiful family and and took really good care of him, and I was so angry probably at my parents that I just was shoved from one home to another. So my experience was entirely different. I know when I started school, when I asked other refugee kids, how often were you caned, which means you stuck your hand out and a cane wished down and put a blister on your thing, and most of them were not. For me, it was a regular occurrence. It had to do, by the way, it was a stupid practice. I don't believe in that it does anything. The only thing it did with me is I could show them that I could laugh while they whacked me. That's where I got my philosophy of alternative to violence, which I can tell you about if we have time on the end. But in England, there were genuine heroes who took kids in, and everybody was a hero, including the family that took in my cousin, and she was a 10-year-old girl, and they were determined that she was going to be their daughter, and they cut off contact on the outside and forced her to go to church, and eventually she did convert. But she's one of my closest people in the world today, on all kinds of levels, her and her family. I'm going to talk a little bit about these two, and then I'm going to pick up some of those things and tell you about them. Yeah, that would be good. So this map shows what happened in 1903, how the family went to Hanover, and where the different parts of the family went up until 1938. When some members of our family, who aunts and uncles who had money, went to places like South Africa, Australia, and I actually have a book here which I got which my cousin put together about 10 years ago. I never got any letters from my mother or my sister after I left. Or my grandfather. They were all murdered. I found out that my sister had got back to my parents, and that she was studying English so she could speak to me, and she had a job, and there were like 20 people in one room. And then later I found out that on one day they came in and they took all the Jews, and within a short period of time they were murdered. When about 10 years ago, when my grandson had a bar mitzvah, and he did it in Israel, my son got a hold of all of our family who were there, because some of them had escaped and had got to Palestine. And then they released all these letters that my mother, my father, my sister, and my aunts and uncles from South Africa, as they were running at different places. And this is just an amazing book they put together. And in it, I read these beautiful letters that my sister wrote, how she's studying English. For us, I read one amazing letter from my mother. She was being taken from one camp to another, and she got a letter to a Red Cross group which sent it to Palestine. And in the letter, instead of saying what is happening to them, because they had had horrible, horrible experiences, and she had to know at that point that they were on their way to being murdered. And what does she write about? She writes about the beauty of the mountains, the beauty of the sky, the beauty of the trees. And when I read that, something told me that I have to walk there. And when I was at Brookdale at the Holocaust Center, speaking with my daughter and my granddaughter, I said I'm going back, and I retraced my steps 76 years later, and this is really the map of that retracing. We started off in Budapest because they wanted me there as a speaker, and I could speak for an hour about that. And then we got to Poland, and we retraced our steps, and I was able to make amazing finds of all kinds of things, because I was met there by the son of a friend who I didn't know in Germany. I didn't know when we were driven across the border. I didn't know he was on my boat, but he did become my brother's best friend in a Jewish home that they stayed for a while. And his son is a filmmaker, and he was making a film about his dad, and when he heard that I was going, he went and he did amazing research. So when I got to the town of Spongen, where they had taken me off in the field, I found the railway station was entirely devoted to refugee children. It was used furniture and used clothes were being sold to help refugee children. The signs on that whole railway station, inside and outside, were about the day we were driven across the border. They presented me with a beautiful book about that day. And then most amazing of all, here I'm coming back 76 years later, and they show me all these documents with my name on it. And it was totally amazing. I mean, one of the amazing things about that town is that I think it was a town of 3,000 people, and I don't know, at least 9,000 of us descended on that town. And I don't remember having any fear. I don't remember any hatred. I mean, the refugee organizations probably brought a little bit of prosperity to the town, but it could have been so horrible. And in spite of the fact that people were sleeping in the streets, I think the people in that town were heroes for putting up with that. Every once in a while I expect to see a hand go up with a question. One of the, let me see if I can find the picture. One of the amazing parts of that trip was this guy took us deep into the woods to this Ort place. I don't know if I'm going to find it. I got too many papers. To this Ort place, and I looked at this broken down 3-story building, and I didn't recognize anything, and climbed in. And I was there with my grandchildren, and climbed in through the window, and it was like a flashback. It was like unbelievable, because my grandfather had visited me there in the 10 days, my sister, and somehow or the other, when I felt a lot lighter when I came out. I had gone inside to say goodbye to my sister. She would have been 90 at that point. And she was murdered when she was 14. Well, how do you murder a 14-year-old girl, or how do you murder a baby? Well, I guess because of your own inadequacy, you consider them a lesser person than you, and because that's the only way you can make yourself feel good. That's the only pathetic answer I have. So what would have happened if people had not been bystanders? The Germans came into one Greek island, and they took over, and they said, give me a list of all the Jews. And they got a list of all the Jews, and they had them all killed. They got into another island, they did the same thing. Got into one island, and they went to the mayor, and the mayor said, come back tomorrow. And the next day, they were met by the archbishop and the mayor, and they handed them the list. It had the name of the archbishop, it had the name of the mayor. Said, this is it. You want to take somebody, we're the 2 Jews on the island. And nothing happened to the Jews on that island. They survived the war. Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany, they had taken most of the Jews out already, and there were, I don't know, there was maybe 1,000 Christian women who were married to Jewish men, and they organized to have 6,000 women go to Nazi headquarters, and they said, we're not moving till you stop it, until you send back the ones you sent. And they won. The 2,000 Jewish men who were living in Berlin survived, not under good conditions. They survived the war. There was some who were actually sent back from camps where they would have been killed. And there's quite a few. There was one town in France where the entire town got together, and not one Jew was killed. When the Germans came in, not every Jew survived. The entire town stood behind them. And in most places, they didn't. A question?
I'm going to pass the microphone around, okay? Come on, questions, everybody. I know we have them. I have a question, Mr.
Yeah.
What time were you most afraid? At what point in your life during that process were you the most afraid?
I think I got, when I was with my parents, I had no fear. You know, it was with them, I was the little one, and I was surrounded. As long as I was surrounded, there was no fear. When they left me, I was so angry that for a long, long time, I was in trouble all the time. So no, the word it was more anger. I spent most of my time in Christian homes and always clung to the fact that I was Jewish, and there was nobody who was going to tell me anything else. And when I read the letters that my cousin from Scotland wrote, that's the way she was crying most of the time. That's the way she was for the first couple of years. But she's got one beautiful family there. So how do you make a difference? I'm sure, if anybody wants to challenge what I'm saying, every one of you have been a bystander in your life. Every one of you. If somebody thinks they never have, let me see your hand go up. Okay, you've never been a bystander. You've never seen anybody put down. You've never heard anybody called a name and not said anything. You sure?
Like sometimes, but
Okay.
people would do things about it.
Well, let me tell you the time I was a bystander. I come to America, I go to Freehold High School, and somebody making a difference, they heard about me. And somebody came up to me and said, "You don't know anybody here. I'm going to be your buddy until you get to know people." He was never my buddy. Do you have any idea what a difference he made in my life? That here I am in this strange place with all this background, and somebody's coming up and telling me, it's so easy to make a difference in somebody's life. It really is. So Freehold High School, we're senior class, we're taking our class trip to Washington, D.C., and the bus stops outside of Washington, D.C., and some of the people get off the bus. And I'm looking in amazement. Why are they getting off the bus? They're not allowed to be in the bus in front of our hotel. This is the United States of America. This is the nation's capital. I sunk down in my seat. I looked around. Nobody else even noticed anything. It was like nothing was going on. I'm feeling horrible. What's going on here? They were obviously African Americans, and I didn't say anything. And when I got back, I found that Ingeborg Lederer, a Jewish refugee, was the only one outside the school saying that this school is guilty of racism when we take our kids and do that to them. And that was the point that I became an activist. So I made use of me being a bystander, and after that I was active all over the place. You guys are not asking enough questions. Come on, think of one.
You said there were like documents with your name on it in the train station. Like what type of documents were they?
Oh, documents with with a list of the kids who were destined. I left the book in the car. I was late, so I ran in. There was a list of the kids who were going to go on the boat, as an example, and I saw my number, which was 101 out of 100. And there were other documents there of when I arrived. So these were 76-year-old documents. But in this book, I'll tell you an amazing story. So I called it Odyssey 76, and my grandson put something, odyssey76.com. You might be able to get some of it. So we take this trip, and I had to dedicate it to something. And so then I thought, okay, I'm looking for organizations, and I wanted it to be a Jewish one because that resonated with me. And so Hyas met us when we got to Poland and helped. They helped get us to the train. When we got to America, after being in this environment for 6 years. Both of us ended up in the hospital. My brother ended up spending 5 months at Temple University Hospital, and HIAS, the same organization, was there for him and helped him. He spent 5 months there because as a refugee kid, nobody looked at his teeth. They were all rotten, and it infected all his organs. Mine was a little bit less. I didn't spend that kind of time. But they were there for us. So what are they doing now? They're taking care of 157,000 kids, or have programs for 157,000 kids with the kids from Darfur. And they're refugee kids, and anything you can do for these refugee kids is amazing because, here was an organization that I really related to. I came back, they invited me to speak to their board of directors, and when I went to them, they presented me with this book. And again, 70-year-old documents they had in their archives, and it's all about how my uncle, most of them, but it goes all the way through the war, and they're all about me, but most of it was about my uncle trying to get them to give good care to my brother, who was close to death this whole time and was in a ward with 20 people, which I don't think they have wards like that anymore. So I raised money for them, and I feel really good that about what they're doing today. And I actually met workers from Africa who were working with the kids. Next question. Yeah.
When you were in Germany, what do you think was possibly the biggest protest against like all the people that were there?
Basically, in my hometown, there was no protest at all. There wasn't any. As an example, the newspaper headline, when they emptied out the Jewish old age home, and a lot of the people were on gurneys, and they took them off to send them to a camp to be killed. The headline was, "Ohne endlich Judenrein." Germany is, UNA is finally free of Jews. I mean, it is so disgusting. I want to see if I can find this. I think I have more pictures in my. Can you look in the case if there's any more? No, it's empty. Yeah. No. Okay. Okay. I forget what I was going to say. So
You were talking about the protesting. Was there any protesting?
Yeah. There really wasn't any. The protests I told you about, there was a few like that, and they made were they heroes? Oh yeah, they were heroes. They were always heroes. Nobody asked me how I got to the United States. Is anybody interested? Who? You? I believe in alternative to violence. I used to spend a lot of time as a volunteer in prisons with a Quaker group, Alternative to Violence Project, giving workshops on alternative to violence. My uncle had no understanding of that whole concept. He went by his guts, and he was in an internment camp in Holland, and he saw a pregnant woman getting kicked in the stomach, and I didn't get this story from him. I got it from somebody else who was there, and he committed suicide, in effect, by going and whacking the guy in the jaw and knocking him out. They beat him up really bad. This was early on. If it was a little bit later, they probably would have killed him on the spot. They threw him onto a train, and this is in Holland. Holland was a bad place for Jews. Jews in hiding were mostly given up, more so than in other countries. There were less heroes there. Anne Frank was an example of somebody who was given up, but they were heroes. And people who were in an underground heard about him. They got him off the train, and they took him to I guess I didn't bring most of my stuff with me. They took him to a guy by the name of Jaap Pendrik. I have a book about him. Now, Jaap Pendrik needed to do something. He said, I can't just stand by. There was no demonstrations to go to because the people weren't demonstrating. So he was a printer. So he printed forged documents for Jewish young men. He started with one. By the time when he stopped, he'd done 1,200. And all of those 1,200 men survived. They all got out. He was amazing. He was told to stop, and he did. And they took him there, and with the documents that he gave him that he was on an assignment for the Nazis, he was able to go to France, and from France to Africa, and from Africa in 1941 he got to the United States. He was able to pick up my aunt along the way, and he was one of the few who got in. If they would have picked up the fact that my aunt had stomach typhus at Ellis Island, they wouldn't have let him in, but they wouldn't have let my brother in either if they would have known what he had, because you had to be healthy to get through Ellis Island. And they both worked in a sweatshop, and he ended up owning a chicken farm in Farmingdale, together with about 4,000 other refugees. All of them went broke eventually. And in 1946, he brought me and my brother to the United States. That was a good question. Another one? Yeah.
Like, when did this happen? Like when you were really little, or?
When we were chased across the border, I wasn't 6 yet.
Oh.
And when I got to England, I wasn't 7. So people trying to make a statement, looking at the history. So this artist was trying to figure out what he could do. So he's in Cologne, I think we call it. And one night, he got together 80 brass things with the names of the people that had been killed, and he dug up the pavement in front of 80 different houses. He worked all night, and put them in the pavement. In the morning, he started to get into trouble, and then everybody realized what he had done. He put them in the pavement outside of their homes or their businesses. And it made a huge difference to people to see that their life was recognized. So when they were putting them in front of my father's store, I went there, and and I met him. And at this point, there's like 30,000 of them across Europe. So this is my mother and father's name and my sister, and they have me and my brother's name there as deported. Generally, when you see deported, you don't think of people being chased across the border with dogs from the country they were born in. But so So one of the scenes then is that at this dedication, the minister from the church was there, and I saw him there with tears in his eyes, and I said, "Why do you have tears in your eyes? You were not born. You had nothing to do with it, absolutely nothing." He said, "My church was here. They were here." And it was such a poignant statement, because there's nothing that the next generation bears absolutely no guilt. Anybody who puts the guilt on the next generation is becoming one of them. However, the next generation needs to come to terms with what they did. The Japanese have a lot of trouble coming to terms with some of the horrors that they did, where they took thousands of women and treated them like garbage, and the Turks with the Armenians. The whole thing would have been ancient history if they would come to terms with what the previous generation had done. And they keep it alive by not admitting it. And just as we need to come to terms with the fact of the horrible, horrible suffering that we inflicted. I'm talking about generations back, when we brought slaves to the United States and we threw them in the water when British boats were coming, and we didn't treat them like human beings. And we are not responsible. We didn't do it, but we need to come to terms with the fact that yes, America did do it, and it was a bad thing. So one of the questions I'm sometimes asked when people ask questions is, why are we here talking about the Holocaust? Are you trying to say that the suffering of people in the Holocaust was worse than slavery, and the death caused there was worse than all the other, than things that are happening now, people having their heads cut up and horrible things happening? No. The Holocaust, the suffering, you don't compare suffering. Suffering is a horror, but the Holocaust has one singularity. If you had a Jewish grandparent, you were considered flawed and you needed to be get rid of to make the race pure. And it is such absolute garbage and nonsense. I don't care where you go or who you're with, we have so much more in common with each other than differences. My stomach used to tighten up when I met anybody German, and that's including the next generation. And I was doing a workshop at a maximum security prison. I got a call from a German woman, I don't know, about 20 years old, saying, "Can I come in and help you?" And I said, "You can come in and take the 3-day workshop. You can't leave it." So she came in, and I found this wonderful, beautiful human being who was not permitted in her grandparents' house because they were Nazis. Her parents wouldn't let her bring up the subject, and she was going through all kinds of turmoil and was trying to make the world a better place by volunteering in different places. And she wanted to be there with me because of my history. And I think after I met a few people like that, because I met Germans who would go to peace demonstrations or environmental actions in all kinds of different places, and they were trying to make sense of their lives when they know what the generation before them had done. Would there have been a Holocaust if there were no bystanders? Absolutely not. Do bad things happen around us because we are bystanders? Absolutely. And I think we can make such a difference when we see something something bad happening, and we react. How much time do I have?
Maybe like 5 minutes. More questions? Come on, some more questions. Go ahead.
When you first came to the United States, were you like scared when you first went to school?
No, I was still angry. I hadn't got over it yet. So I kind of got into a little trouble too, and I think the senior trip to Washington made a huge difference, because there's nothing more beautiful in your life than making a difference. There's nothing more beautiful than making a difference by volunteering for something, and I started to do that. I'll give you a couple of examples. I volunteered. The Hudson River, you couldn't swim any place on it from New York all the way up, because it was full of chemicals and garbage and all kinds of stuff. And the fish, the fish, it was dangerous to eat them. And I became active in Clearwater, and I would volunteer for 6 days at a time. We would sail on the Hudson, we would take kids out, we would put the nets down, and it was those 6 days each time were the best possible vacation I could get. On the Clearwater, there was a fundraiser for this prison project, and I found that in prison I could really make a difference in people's lives by showing them how you can win without having the other guy lose, how you can transform situations. Then a bunch of us got together because the Atlantic Ocean is so polluted that it's getting worse and worse. And well, that was 25 years ago. We actually sailed from New York to Leningrad. We just had a 25-year reunion. And all of this stuff was so good and exciting, and something good came out of all of it. And so I can't say enough about finding something you have a passion for and volunteering. But you can make a difference. Does anybody here thinks that they can't change the world? You know, you really can. And
Your hand. A lot of you do passion projects, right?
you can change the world in your classroom. Yeah. You can change the world. You can change the world in your family. You can change somebody's world when you see them being bullied and you stand up for them. And maybe you can even make a difference in the bully by getting them to see that they're okay. They don't need to pick on somebody else to feel good about themselves. And once they realize how small they are by picking on somebody else, they're going to stop. I honestly believe that. That's the only reason somebody's a bully, because they don't feel good about themselves. So they make themselves bigger than somebody else. This is the document. You want to know how old I was? This is the document they gave me in Poland. And so in my hometown, my brother, he died 20 years ago, but he had a fabulous life, and he was always an achiever. When he was dying, besides telling me about the darkest point in our lives and how his life was, so he made me see his life as a celebration. But one other place in the world where he had lectured was in my hometown, or a local university there. And he said, they claim in my town that our sister's alive. He says, after I'm gone, why don't you just go spend 2 days and find out why they're insisting on this nonsense. And what had happened before, I had gone to Germany with my children and grandchildren, and I saw the memorial. It didn't have my grandfather's name on it, and it didn't have my sister's name on it. And when I asked they gave me this nonsense, and I said, I'm not coming back. Well, when I went back after my brother told me that, I put her picture in the paper, in the local paper. I don't know if I have a copy, but it doesn't make any difference. And I asked if anybody knew her to come to a meeting, and I got a local historian to arrange it with me. Her class was 43 girls. 20 women showed up, and they all said the same thing, that she's alive. They had all been her friends, and they had all turned against her. And they had made this story up that we didn't turn our backs, then she was killed. Not possible. And I spoke to them all over a period of 6 days, found out it was nonsense. I left, and 20 years later, I told this story to my friend Fred Spiegel, who was a survivor who lived 20 miles from me. I didn't know him then. And he used to talk in that area. He went to the schools. So he went back to my hometown. He made them investigate. And they found out that she had been murdered. And they put her name on. And at that point, we went back. We went back, and the town greeted us, and her name is on there. So hers is bright, and the rest is wearing out at this point. But the last 250 miles on my return we did by bicycle, because I didn't want to go by train, and I wanted to be closer to people, and it was actually a very good way to go, and was all raising money for HIAS, the group I told you about. Thank you very much. And by the way, if you have any other questions, or if you have any other thoughts, jot them down, and your teacher will get them to me. Okay, thank you.